Discussions of budgets, debt, and deficits frequently dominate our news media, but these discussions can often be shallow sound bites or accusations of one interest group or politician trying to score political points or denigrate a policy they don't support. What's usually missing is a rational, measured analysis to help citizens better understand these terms and their implications for the economy. This lesson uses economic reasoning to provide students with powerful critical thinking tools they can apply to the discussion of budgets, debt, and deficits. In this activity, students learn how and where the federal government spends money as they work in teams to allocate 100 pennies across 14 categories, as they think the government allocates money in the federal budget. They'll predict how much of that spending is mandatory versus discretionary, and how much of that spending is actually covered by tax revenue. Along the way, students get to compare their predictions with the actual budget of the federal government and discuss ways to deal with a shortfall in tax revenue. To prepare for this lesson, you will need bags of 100 pennies, one bag per group of 4 students. Make one copy of handouts 1 and 2 and a copy of visual 2 for each group. These can also be laminated for reuse. Alternatively, if your students have computers or you're teaching in a virtual classroom environment, students can collaborate using the digital versions of these handouts in the shared Google slides that accompany this lesson. Divide students into groups of 4 and give each group a bag of pennies and a copy of handout 1. Explain that each penny represents 1% of spending in the federal budget, and have them arrange their pennies on handout 1 just as they think they are allocated in the federal budget. For example, if they think agriculture is 3% of total spending, they should place 3 pennies in the agriculture box. So you have a handout that looks like this, and it has 14 different categories, everything from agriculture and administration of justice down to Social Security and veterans benefits, okay? So you start allocating. All the pennies have to be on here somewhere. Just stack them in the appropriate boxes. You want to try to get as close to our federal budget. And I'm going to give you a little hint. We're going to do the allocation pre-COVID, okay? And then later I'm going to show you what it looks like post-COVID. But for now, we're just going to do pre-COVID. How do you think the proportion of pennies are allocated to these categories, all right?
56.
Yeah, it can be 55.
Oh yeah, my bad.
So
Science, space, and technology, I think we care about that.
I think we're good. Yeah, because of the FBI and stuff. Transportation has the TSA. So,
Are they? I don't think the TSA is very well funded.
Isn't that like what is it called? You know how people get paid for like being unemployed and stuff? Is that yeah.
Do you think they care about our education that much?
I really don't, honestly. I don't think we're funded that hard.
After students have had a few minutes to allocate their pennies, display visual 1 to show the actual allocations. Use the chart in the lesson materials to provide some examples of the types of things that are included in each category. For example, administration of justice includes federal law enforcement, litigative, judicial, and correctional activities, as well as criminal justice assistance. Give each group a copy of handout 2, which has the pennies correctly allocated into the 14 categories. There is also a digital version of this handout if your students are collaborating using the shared Google slides. Explain the difference between mandatory and discretionary spending. Now, I'm going to give you another handout that's going to look like this. It's going to have 100 pennies, but now they're actually broken up into these categories. So you can see healthcare is the biggest category, and then Social Security, defense, income security, and they get smaller as we go in this direction. And then now you're going to have a new task, and that's to be able to differentiate between what spending is what we call mandatory spending and what would represent discretionary spending. Explain the difference between mandatory and discretionary spending. Elected officials have the ability to change discretionary spending from year to year as part of the annual budget and appropriations process. Mandatory spending, on the other hand, is determined by law or prior commitments made by government, so it can't be changed as part of the annual budget and appropriations process. So your job now, let me give you the new handout, is to, on this form, I want you to cover, with the pennies you have, every penny that you think represents mandatory spending. Cover it with a real penny, okay?
I'm thinking the environment one is mandatory because we have like laws in place for like national parks and stuff where you have to protect them. And so I feel like that would go towards that.
Yes.
Yeah.
With Social Security, they're like talking about getting rid of it or something. I think. But right now, I think we have to add more to Social Security because right now it's still a law that you.
Yeah.
Like 3. Yes. No, seriously. No.
That's it?
Yeah.
Maybe another round
Alright.
of social.
Got them allocated? After a few minutes, display visual 2 to show the actual breakdown between mandatory and discretionary spending. Okay, were you close? Explain that while interest on the debt is not determined by law, it is a commitment the government made when it borrowed the money previously, so it's included here with mandatory spending. Debrief this portion of the activity by asking students to share how their predictions compared to the actual spending. Find out what surprised them most. Most all of income security is mandatory spending. None of defense. Use Visual 3 to answer student questions and share actual numbers. Point out that most of the budget categories include both mandatory and discretionary spending. For the second part of this activity, have the students count out the number of pennies that represent the total amount of money the federal government brings in through revenue, or taxes. With this group of students, we chose to use a pre-COVID budget where 78 of the 100 pennies represented tax revenue, as opposed to the 52 or 56 pennies that represented tax revenue during the years with COVID relief spending. The lesson materials include information on how to find the current revenue and spending projections provided by the Congressional Budget Office. Using only the pennies that represent revenue, or the money the government has, have students decide where to spend that revenue by placing the pennies on Visual 2. And ask them to come up with suggestions for how they can deal with the uncovered pennies. And so now you get to decide with those 78 pennies, what are you going to pay for? And how are you going to deal with the pennies that aren't covered? So allocate your 78 pennies of tax revenue that you do have, and then come up with some ideas about how you can deal with what are you going to do to get the rest of that money? Might you cut spending? Come up with some solutions to how would you deal with those uncovered pennies?
Probably cover the yellow first, see how much we have left, and then work around like
We're not putting any on community transport.
Yo, look how many pennies you have left.
Wait, so I'm confused. Defense is like the army and stuff, right? So we pay. So it's mandatory to give the people who are here money. After they're here, it's mandatory to give them money, even though it's not mandatory here. Okay.
Makes
I mean,
sense.
I guess that government want to pay lots of money to education so we cannot be like the worst educated country in the world.
Well, you're going over the actual funds that they.
I want to give him more. I want to give him more money. You can't stop me. I'm gonna give him.
It's got to come from somewhere. What can you do?
Change the law.
You could change laws, and that might free up some of those yellow ones, right? What else could you do?
With defense, I know this, having one or two things like war bonds.
Debrief by asking groups to raise their hands if they chose to cut discretionary spending or mandatory spending. Ask if any of the groups chose to raise taxes or borrow the money, and find out if they had any other creative solutions. And then ask them what the opportunity costs of those choices might have been. But the big takeaway I want you to realize here is that even government officials face opportunity costs when they're making decisions about where do we spend the money and how do we allocate the money. All right, raise your hand if you guys chose to raise taxes. Any groups choose to raise taxes? Groups in the front, right here. Did you guys raise taxes? Okay, we had these guys raise taxes. Again, is that going to be easy? So we have a lot fewer pennies, and where do you think the rest of that money is coming from? Because all of those things are getting paid for. We're borrowing it. Is there an opportunity cost to borrowing money? What's the trade-off there? We do have to pay it back. So we're committing future dollars to pay for consumption today. There's an opportunity cost to that too. Some of that you'll pay for. Some of that your kids and your grandkids will pay for. So that'll be the rest of the story. The majority of federal government spending is mandatory spending, and it's largely spent on entitlement programs. As mandatory spending is projected to grow, decision makers, in this case legislators, face tough decisions and trade-offs. Do they spend less on discretionary categories like defense, education, or infrastructure? Do they borrow more money and commit future spending to fund consumption today? Do they raise taxes? Or do they make changes to laws to change mandatory spending? Even the choices made by decision makers in government have opportunity costs.